paper in Basel III, so we start that here and then finish that in the next video, 7D. But then one of the things, this is a direct snapshot from the Basel III phase-in arrangement. You may recall that I said Basel III, if you want my summary in a nutshell, it adds additional, it builds on the criteria and then tightens them as well. And so Basel III, at the risk, unfortunately, of additional complexity, which is really the last thing it needed, it's imposed additional criteria, protections. So we have a leverage ratio, we have a minimum Tier 1 capital in addition to a minimum total capital. So we have a couple of additional accounts here, including that liquidity, the leverage, the capital conservation buffer, and then now minimum Tier 1 capital. And so you'll still comment if you hear market commentators, they'll talk about the Tier 1 capital ratio. So remember, Tier 1 is, or a total is going to be Tier 1 plus Tier 2. So that's all regulatory capital. But then we can move from Tier 1 to total. So that's going to include Tier 1 and Tier 2. And you can see there's a phase-in. So eventually here, this Basel III contemplates a Tier 1 capital ratio of at least 6% and a total regulatory ratio of at least 8%, total capital, Tier 1 plus Tier 2. So, but then there's also the conservation buffer. And so by the time that gets included, which phases into 2.5%, this total capital actually moves up to 10.5%. Then there are some sort of overrides as well, additional safety valves, if you like, in addition to the capital conservation buffer, which was new and sort of really had the effect to plus up that old Cook ratio. We now have a liquidity coverage ratio and a net stable funding ratio. What are the reasons? Well, the main reason was the financial crisis that really cast some serious doubt, frankly, on the ability of the Basel framework to be effective. Not that everybody was not that everyone had migrated anyway, but it was already controversial. But the crisis had shown that the banking sector was not immune to systemic threats. So banks had built up excessive and on and off balance sheet leverage. There was a gradual erosion of liquidity and quality of the capital base. Many banks were holding insufficient liquidity buffers. The banking system was not able to absorb systemic trading and credit losses. The banking system could not cope with reintermediation of large off-balance sheet exposures that had built up in the shadow banking system. The crisis was further amplified by a pro-cyclical deleveraging process and by interconnectedness of systemic institutions through an array of transactions. So that's a lot of word soup there, but actually that's pretty descriptive of some of the current issue readings that we have. Although it's a little highfalutin, not a bad sentence to summarize some of those themes that are in Gorton, for example. And then during the most severe ups of the crisis, the market lost confidence in the solvency and liquidity of the banking institutions. So obviously one of the overt efforts here in Basel III was to specifically address liquidity and the quality of the capital. So the aims here, I'm not entirely sure why they included Tier 3 in this aim here. I think that's might be, they're asking about the changes to Tier 3, and so it was eliminated. And so Tier 1 now must predominantly be common shares and retained earnings. Okay, so in a sense, I think Tier 1 has become simpler for us. Whereas before Tier 1 had a list of items, I think the safest thing to do with Basel III is to just keep in mind that it's common shareholders' equity and things that are very much contribute to common shareholders' equity. If in doubt on the exam, I would give the benefit of the doubt against items because the whole theme here was to tighten this Tier 1, and where previous instruments or accounts would have counted do not. So we want to be very restrictive with the Tier 1. The remainder of the Tier 1 capital base must be comprised of instruments that are subordinated, have fully discretionary non-cumulative dividends or coupons, and have neither maturity date nor incentive to redeem. Innovative hybrid capital instruments, which previously got into Tier 1, are phased out. So that was a lot of the loophole. Some of these innovative, so-called innovative hybrid capital instruments probably were invented just to qualify as Tier 1, now will be phased out. Tier 2 capital instruments will be harmonized. Criteria include must be issued and paid in, subordinated to depositors, is neither secured nor covered by a guarantee. So you see how all of this makes it more equity-like. Original maturity of at least 5 years, may be callable but only after a minimum of 5 years. And finally, Tier 3 capital instruments are eliminated. Counterparty credit risk, revised metric for better addressing counterparty credit risk, the credit valuation adjustment, and wrong way risk. So we've seen that's thematic has been introduced into Part 2 because really prior to the crisis, although it obviously measures, counterparty exposures were measured, CVA desks existed, but even in the FRM it wasn't given much weight. But since the crisis, the importance of counterparty risk is really recognized for something that's really associated with anything that's an over-the-counter derivative contract. More rigorous requirements for stress testing, including the stress testing program needs to include all of the complete trade capture and exposure aggregation, at least monthly for all counterparties, at least quarterly apply the multi-factor stress testing scenarios, and at least quarterly should conduct stress testing applying stress conditions to the joint movement of exposures and counterparty creditworthiness. The stress test program must include several elements, including should be integrated into reporting to senior management. The severity of the factor shocks should be consistent with the purpose of the stress test. Banks should consider reverse stress tests to identify extreme but plausible scenarios. And senior management must take a lead role. Basel, like everybody else, wants to reevaluate the role of external credit ratings, and it's a little bit difficult because they can't just eliminate them. So one way to address that was disclosure. An ECAI should disclose the following information: its code of conduct, the nature of its compensation, the assessment methodologies. So thematically similar to what the SEC is trying to do with credit rating agencies in the or nationally recognized statistical rating organizations, similar to what the SEC is trying to do, enforcing, trying to impose higher quality, partly through disclosure of both the arrangements, potential conflicts, but also the methodologies, and then some operational requirements. And the committee agreed to introduce a simple, transparent, non-risk-based leverage ratio that is calibrated to act as a credible supplementary measure to the risk-based capital requirement. So the thing about the leverage ratio is that it's not risk adjusted. So this is maybe so far among Basel the one ratio that we can read or almost read directly from the balance sheet account. Capital divided by total exposure, where capital is, the numerator here is Tier 1 capital, so that's pretty much going to be common equity. And then total exposure is going to be a lot like assets, but it's going to include off-balance sheet items. So we got to be careful about that. We want the exposure to include both on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet items. The committee will test a minimum Tier 1 leverage ratio of 3% during the parallel run. And by the way, so it's not that unusual to see this expressed as a reciprocal, right? Nothing magic about the fact that we've expressed capital into the total exposure as 3%. We could invert these and express that as, well, if I take 1 divided by 0.03, approximately 33.3 leverage ratio. Nothing magic about which direction we express that ratio. Although in the Basel, it's capital divided by total exposure. The other thing Basel III added is this counter-cyclical buffer. So notice the aim: discuss changes designed to dampen the pro-cyclical amplification of financial shocks. So there's this fear that the regulations could be pro-cyclical. That is, they could make things worse when they're getting worse. So banks will be subject to a counter-cyclical buffer that varies between 0 and 2.5% of total risk-weighted assets. So this is another, increases or potentially increases the regulatory requirement. And then changes to address the systemic risk. Capital incentives for banks to use central counterparties, higher capital requirements for trading and derivative activities, higher capital requirements for inter-financial sector exposure, and the introduction of liquidity requirements that penalize excessive reliance on short-term interbank funding to support long-dated assets. And then finally, this last aim still should be pushed forward to the next. I thought GARP would fix that by now. They have not. And